Boker Tov, good Monday morning for you. I want to discuss a subject I have discussed on numerous occasions before, going back years, but it's becoming increasingly urgent, not critical, but acute, and that is the economy as it relates to the debt. So hear me out here. I'll try to keep this to 10 minutes. We'll see how I do that. I don't see a stopwatch, but we'll try. Um, so we've accumulated a debt, not deficit. I'm referring to the debt, the outstanding unfunded liabilities, you could say, of approximately $30 trillion. Now, there have been years when our debt was, uh, you know, considered high, and it was in the neighborhood of 50% of the GDP, which is to say the amount of debt was equivalent to half of the total gross national product. And for a long time, we've been warned that anything getting above that was dangerous, and that we needed to stay below 100%. We are now at we're now at approximately 130%, moving very closely to 140% of GDP. But that's just the debt. What's also continuing to climb up rapidly are what are called unfunded liabilities. These are entitlement programs, etc., Social Security, Medicare, and the like, others as well, pensions. And we also have we continue to accumulate a very substantial deficit every year, so we're compounding that, and we have been doing this all recently at a historically low, virtually negative interest rate. Federal funds rate down around a 0 to 0.25 basis points, a quarter of a point. The T-bill for some years now, the 10-year has been below well, it's been for a long time. It's below 1, but now it's still below 1.6, which is historically very low. Even under 2% is considered low. So we're accumulating this deficit, but we're not contributing a lot to interest to cover the debt. Mind you, the unfunded liabilities. And now what we have is this inflation that's starting to run away, which is to say, while the Fed is ignoring it, is dismissing it as transitory or temporary. Most of us know that that's not the case yet, and that if interest rates were to rise up, well, just look at the way your mortgage would go up if your interest on your mortgage was 1% versus 4%, right? Let alone 5 or 6%. I mean, it doesn't take a genius to realize that when you apply that to our debt, it's extraordinary. But these entitlements and these other things that contribute to the deficit and the debt, the unfunded liabilities I mentioned before, which add up to altogether with the debt over almost $200 trillion. Now, the thing is that all of this is subject to what is called cost of living, or COLA increases, much of it. So government salaries, Medicare, Social Security, much of this goes up by the rate of by some indexed factor based on inflation. So not only does the interest go up, but the rate at which these elements grow is compounded by inflation. And the fact is, there's no stopping it now. We've gotten to a point where, you can't get ahead of it. We cannot get ahead of it. It is beyond our economy's ability to support it. Now, the Fed would have you to believe, Biden particularly would have you to believe that we can. I mean, he even says there's totally no increase, no cost to this, his plans. But the fact of the matter is there's substantial costs, and as we all know, the Fed talks a talk about tapering, but there's no way they're going to taper. They talk about tapering by $5 billion, but their monthly purchases of treasuries, that's in their recent Fed meeting, but possibly sometime in the near future. The amount they're talking about tapering will be dwarfed by the amount that the deficit will grow. And who's going to buy these things? Who's going to buy T-bills that are at 1.5%? Now, mind you, the federal government has made a huge mistake. I've said this before, by what is essentially the age of our treasuries. We had an opportunity for many years here to lock in these low rates for long term, 20-year, 30-year treasuries. But the average age of our debt is substantially short. So debt that was issued at 0.5% a year ago or so is now subject to, potentially going to 3% or whatever the number may be. But even that is not the rate of inflation. So we are going to have a huge problem, which is unsustainable. And we're seeing that an unsustainable problem spirals. It builds on itself like inflation does. All right. So what I'm simply saying is that there will come a point. I'll call it a day of reckoning, when this house of cards will come down. Now, we've heard about that a long time. I know that people have talked about that when we weren't balancing our budget. But the fact of the matter is, we haven't heard about it that long in comparison to how long our debt and deficits have been this large. This began possibly with Bush, certainly with Obama. It kept happening with Trump, and now it's ballooning with Biden. And if the squad had their hand in it, it would be astronomically faster. So what's really happening is we are building up a crisis that's eventually going to hit us. Now, why would it hit us if it hasn't hit us so far? Well, that's because the financial markets have given us a pass. The people are in equities, and as long as they're in equities, they perceive this growth, this spending, to have a positive influence on equities, which is why you have these, record highs on equities. And I believe that will continue. I believe that the Federal Reserve will continue to print enormous amounts of money, because we've shifted, as I've said in the past, from a Keynesian kind of mentality to modern monetary theory, which is to say debt doesn't matter. That's right. They're going to tell you that it doesn't matter. They're going to get to a point where it's broken, because that's what Build Back Better is. That's what the Great Reset is. They're going to tell you that it's broken, and then they'll say, but it doesn't matter. Because under modern monetary theory, the debt is irrelevant. All that matters is inflation or maybe employment. And therefore, we can print as much money as we want. It's not like your household. You don't have a printing press. Businesses don't have printing presses. Government does. So if government needs money, it just prints money. What's to stop it? Well, the only thing to stop it is inflation. Really, at the end of the day, is inflation and the notion that the realization that we are literally unable to afford sustaining our economy without printing money. Where the dependency is so great, and then that triggers a panic. When people start to get nervous, and to the point where markets are reactive and 6 months in advance, that there is a crash. Now, it could start as a gradual decline, but it can snowball, like the expression, and build on itself. And then you have the makings of a all-out collapse. And when that happens, all bets are off. Equities can plummet. Okay? At that point, out of fear, treasuries can start to go up, but also with that, interest rates could potentially skyrocket. In other words, people could be afraid to be in low interest, long-term debt, and thus shun those things, forcing the Treasury to buy more, but also essentially exacerbating the problem they're trying to solve. So it becomes a no-win situation. And I know this is complex because the relationships are very confusing for a lot of people. The notion that, as bond prices go up, interest rates go down, or vice versa, is a counterintuitive to a lot of folks, that one thing goes up and another thing goes down. But think of a seesaw. There's a fulcrum and there's a lever, in a sense. One side goes down, the other side goes up. This is not an unusual physics concept. So what happens at that point is that everything starts to collapse in this economy. At which point, who has any money? If the stock market crashes and businesses can't borrow and businesses crash and wealth generally is demolished around the world, businesses will fire like crazy, close like crazy. Okay? Who has the money to salvage this? Only the government. Now we saw this in the elite, BlackRock, okay, the global elite, the central banks. So in an effort to save the economy, you might say, they have to buy the agents of production. They have to buy businesses. They have to buy stocks. All right? They have to inject money into the economy that way. Okay, they have to buy bonds, so the government has to spend money. Essentially, the only thing floating the economy is the Treasury. In effect, they own the economy. They own the agents of production. The only thing that's able to produce anything is money that comes from the Treasury, printed money. So you have this situation where, well, if you go back to the subprime crisis, who bought these banks? Who bailed out these banks? The government. And what did? They took ownership in these banks. Of course, they bought back their ownership at very discounted prices, at higher prices, you might say. But the fact of the matter, or really discounted in a way too, but they bought back because ultimately the big banks, one could say the Illuminati, one could say the Great Reset. One could say a lot of things that sound like conspiracies, but at the end of the day, it's just a practical matter of nobody's got money if everybody's crashed, except the ability of the government to print money, and the big banks, which can obviously have access to that money for nothing, because what will start to happen is the Treasury will start to go to negative interest rates, which is to say banks are paid to borrow, you might say. They profit by borrowing or not lending. Okay, so you have this utter collapse of our economic system, and it's disastrous. And what it will be is deflationary. We go from a hyper, and some people don't like that term because technically, I'm using it in a hyperbolic sense. But technically, we may get there, we may not get there. But what we will go from is an extreme level of inflation, as the Fed continues this massive influx and this spending, and stocks continue to rise. And then we have a sharp reversal, the panic, and then you have a sharp reversal, and you have a massive deflationary cycle, which is a whipsaw. It's very hard to prepare for that. Where do you go? Now, people don't like to time markets. There's generally been a bad practice. It hasn't worked out for most people. Some folks are very good at it. If you watch the movie The Big Short, which is about the subprime, the investor who has predicted a major crash, by the way, the worse than the subprime, he is betting on that. The same guy that bet on subprime. He could have lost his shirt because for a significant period of time, what he was predicting, and by shorting the market, was not happening. And his short positions were losing a fortune. And had he not had the wealth, he really would have been squeezed out. He would have been squeezed out with his losses. But he was able to withstand, double down, triple down, and ultimately profited ginormously from what he predicted. But most people cannot have the staying power because we're often wrong. I personally tend to be early. I know from my own history throughout my life, I have had a lot of predictions over the course of my lifetime, and they've been right. Honestly, a lot of them have been right, but I've been early. I have a tendency to be ahead of the stream. Now, I've gotten better over my lifetime at being more accurate from a timing standpoint. But I know that I still have a tendency to be early. In any event, I believe that this is eventually going to be the sequence, whether it happens tomorrow or 2 years from now or 5 years from now. That's a timing question, but this is the sequence. This is the pattern. Inflation to a point where there's a giant correction beyond a bear, essentially depressionary, deflationary, okay? And then it's a question, how do you preserve your wealth? And that's another question I'm not going to go into. It's another strategy I'm not going to talk about right now. But that is going to be the problem. So you have a lot of people that are betting big on the market. I've been betting big and I've been profiting from that bet. But fact is, there will come a time when I have to change my strategy, because I'll be a victim just like everybody else if I don't. So I'm suggesting that we have to think about ways to sustain our wealth. Okay, for some, it's go to cash. It's just sit on the sidelines. Not a bad strategy. Unfortunately, you miss all the opportunities when you do that. You just are guaranteed more or less that you won't be a victim of the crash because you'll be out of the market. But you can lose a lot of money, and I've learned that lesson. You can lose a lot of money being on the sidelines too. And there are some that believe very heavily in cryptocurrencies. That might be the next tulip bust. Some people believe very strongly in cryptocurrencies. I've have an opportunity cost of a fortune by not being in cryptos. I could have made, like a lot of people, a lot of money in cryptos. They don't feel right to me, and so I've stayed on the sidelines of cryptos. But you can move to the sideline and miss out. All right. However, at some point here, there's a catalyst. There has to be a catalyst. There has to be a cause, you might say, for the shift. Okay, so things can be going along fine until they're not, and as I say, then it's too late. But the thing is, what's going to be the catalyst? Now, you might think it's political, you might think it's monetary, you might think it's nations and wars, you might think it's environmental. Or maybe it's all of the above. Maybe it's one into the other, national environmental crises combined with war, combined with, a panic, all right, which leads to more violence and chaos, right? And what you have going into this, you have an absolute lack of leadership. Really, there's not a sense of leadership in the world right now. Won't you agree? So where does leadership come from? Well, now I got to plant a little religious concept into this, because if what I'm describing happens, that will be the question of the day. There will be absolute panic and desperation, and what, if in prophetic terms, that's an open door for what they call the Antichrist. This individual who comes in and, so to speak, is going to save the day. Okay, we know that there's this period of good times. Okay, but the tribulation has a worse period, a horrible period, a period unmatched in any time in history. As far as I'm concerned, that's the final Tish B'Av. That's the final Tish B'Av. God has plagued the Jews throughout thousands of years, through the millennium, with this saddest day in our history, which keeps repeating on itself, adding to the great tragedies that have befell the Jewish people. The Holocaust, Himmler's final solution was dated with Tish B'Av. Okay, but who's to say there's not another one? Nobody. Matter of fact, quite the contrary. History would suggest that we should have another Tish B'Av. But what I've noticed is, with the first Tish B'Av, is theoretically the sin of the spies. It's the time when the Moses sent the 12 leaders from the 12 tribes into the Promised Land to scout it out at God's command. 10 of them came back with, I'll say, negative reports, frightening reports that scared the people. 2, Joseph and Caleb, came back with reports to go because God will be with us. They listened to the reports of the 10, and as a result, that entire generation died in the desert. And that's considered by some to be, by many sages, to be the first Tish B'Av. We didn't obey God. We lost our faith. We didn't obey. But that Tish B'Av was limited to the Jews and to one generation. But subsequent Tish B'Av started to expand in our nation with temple destructions. Again, those were affecting the Jews, but of multiple generations. Okay, but as time went on, you had Tish B'Av that affected other countries, like France and Austria and England and Spain, all of whom expelled the Jews. Those Tish B'Avs, which occurred on Tish B'Av, those affected the countries, not just the Jewish population. And you get to what might be considered one of the worst Tish B'Avs, the Holocaust. And there you have something that affected Europe, a whole section of the world, and maybe the world, right? And so I see this pattern of the Tish B'Av expansion getting worse and affecting a wider circle. But the head of the tribunal, the military tribunal at Nuremberg, made a very famous statement that we had to, I'll paraphrase it, that we had to study this, we had to remember this, because the world could never let it happen again, because the world couldn't handle it. It couldn't handle it happening again. In other words, another event like the Holocaust, like World War II, the world could not survive it. And it was a very prophetic concept, because back at that time we had just 2 bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But now we have hypersonic missiles that China has. We have an incredible number of nuclear missiles that will certainly destroy the Earth, or mankind and living creatures, ready to be launched with artificial intelligence, potentially without a moment's notice, possibly without man's intervention. Okay, the next Tish B'Av, I'm afraid, folks, could be what is known as Revelation. So you could talk about sustaining your wealth, but in my perspective is, if this Tish B'Av happens, you won't be able to sustain your wealth. The only question is whether you can sustain your life. And on that tragic thought, on that horrible thought, I would suggest to you there are things you can do to prepare yourself. What really matters. Okay? Have a good week.